Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What if the woman you were about to marry was hiding a secret buried 6 feet under your own backyard? Not metaphorically. Literally. This is the kind of story that starts with silk pajamas and a moonlit garden, and ends with a truth that changes everything. Stay with me. This one gets unbelievable. Welcome back, friends. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing who's sitting with me for these stories. Tonight's story is about love, secrets, and the kind of courage most people never have to find. Let's begin. The moon hung heavy over the estate that night, the kind of full moon that made shadows look alive, stretching long fingers of darkness across the perfectly trimmed hedges and the marble fountain that hadn't run in years. Ethan Cole couldn't sleep. He'd tried everything. Warm milk, a chapter of the biography sitting on his nightstand, even counting the crown moldings on the ceiling of his enormous bedroom. Nothing worked. Something in his chest felt wrong, restless, like a warning his body understood before his mind did. It was the kind of feeling he usually got before a business deal collapsed, a gut-deep unease that refused to be reasoned away. He wandered downstairs in his white silk pajamas, his bare feet cold against the marble floor, expecting nothing more than a glass of water and the quiet hum of his own thoughts. The house was silent except for the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second stretching a little longer than it should. Instead, through the tall glass doors leading to the garden, he saw her, Eva, his fiancée, the woman he was supposed to marry in 6 weeks, the woman whose laugh he'd fallen in love with before he'd even learned her last name. She was kneeling in the rose garden at 1 a.m, her pink satin gown streaked with dirt, her bare hands buried in the earth like she was fighting the ground itself. A shovel lay discarded in the grass beside her, its blade catching the moonlight. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He stood frozen at the glass door for a moment, telling himself there was an explanation. A lost necklace, a buried time capsule from childhood, anything logical, anything that made sense in a world where the woman he loved wasn't kneeling in mud at midnight like something out of a nightmare. But logic dissolved the second he stepped outside and the cool night air hit his face, the second he got close enough to see the shape of the hole she'd dug. It wasn't small. It wasn't shallow. It was the size and depth of something meant to hide a person, and the sight of it made his stomach twist into a knot so tight he could barely breathe. Ava! His voice cracked the silence, thin and unsteady. She didn't turn. She didn't even flinch, as if she hadn't heard him at all, as if the entire world outside that hole had ceased to exist for her. She kept digging, desperate, sobbing quietly under her breath, whispering words he couldn't yet make out, fragments of sentences, a name repeated over and over like a prayer. Ethan took another step closer, his mind racing through a dozen impossible explanations, none of them making any sense. He noticed her manicured hands were torn and bleeding, her engagement ring caked in mud, her hair falling loose from what had once been an elegant knot. This wasn't the composed, graceful woman who ran board meetings with quiet authority. This was someone unraveling in real time. And then he saw it. Hand. Trembling. Breaking through the loose soil at the bottom of the pit. Fingers stretching toward the moonlight like it was reaching for air itself, like it had been starved of it for far too long. Ethan's whole world tilted sideways. He staggered back a step, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. For one terrible silent moment, he thought about running back inside, calling the police, calling anyone, but something about the sound Ava made, a sound of pure anguish, pulled him forward instead of away. He knelt down beside her without deciding to, his silk pajamas sinking into the wet earth. "Ava, talk to me," he said, his voice shaking now, all pretense of calm gone. "What is happening right now? Please." She finally turned to look at him, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't the guilt of someone caught doing something terrible. It was terror, raw, uncontained, bottomless terror, The kind that comes from someone who has been running from something far longer than just tonight, something that had clearly been eating away at her in silence for a long, long time. "Help me," she begged, her voice breaking apart with every word. "Please, Ethan. There's no time. She's still breathing. I can feel it, she's still breathing." The word hit him like a physical blow. Ethan's mind scrambled to make sense of it, but there was no time to ask questions, no time to demand explanations. Whatever was happening, whoever was buried beneath that ground was still alive, and every second they spent talking instead of digging was a second that could cost a life. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop, to think, to protect himself from whatever madness had gripped his fiancée in the dead of night. But love doesn't operate on instinct for self-preservation. It operates on something deeper, something that made him drop to his knees beside her without another word and start digging with his bare hands, tearing at the cold, wet earth alongside the woman he loved, both of them driven by a desperation neither could yet fully explain. For a moment, neither of them moved fast enough to keep up with their own fear. The hand kept twitching in the dirt, fingers curling and uncurling weakly, desperate and fading, and every second felt like it might be the last one before that movement stopped forever. "Ava, what is that? What did you do?" Ethan's voice shook, torn between horror and disbelief. His mind still trying to reconcile the gentle, composed woman he knew with the mud-streaked stranger digging beside him. She finally looked up at him properly this time, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt smeared across her cheeks. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice cracking. "I would never. Ethan, please, just help me. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just help me get her out first." Ethan dropped every question he had and dug harder, years of instinct and love overriding his fear completely. Together they clawed at the earth, his silk pajamas ruining in the mud, his manicured hands bleeding from broken fingernails and jagged rock, the two of them working in a rhythm born of pure panic rather than plan. Slowly, painfully, an arm emerged from the soil. Then a shoulder, thin and trembling. Then a face, pale, bruised, streaked with dirt and dried blood, eyes fluttering weakly beneath a layer of grime, lips cracked from what looked like days without water. Ethan froze completely, his hands stopping mid-motion. The woman in the ground had Ava's exact face. Same eyes, wide and glassy with exhaustion. Same jawline, sharp even through the dirt and swelling. Same trembling mouth, gasping for air like she'd forgotten how breathing was supposed to feel. "Who is she?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own racing heartbeat. Ava's hands were shaking so hard now she could barely keep digging. Tears streamed freely down her face, mixing with the dirt, her whole body trembling with a mixture of relief and horror that seemed too large for her to hold inside. "She's my sister," Ava said, her voice breaking on every word. "My twin sister, Mia. Everyone thinks she died 3 years ago, Ethan. Everyone. I went to her funeral. I threw dirt on an empty casket. But she didn't die. She was buried alive. And I just found out tonight, an hour ago, that I might be the only person in the entire world who could save her." The wind seemed to stop entirely. The crickets went silent. Even the old clock inside the house, audible faintly through the open door, seemed to pause between ticks. Everything Ethan thought he knew about the woman he loved, the woman he'd planned an entire future with, cracked wide open in that single moment, and he understood with sudden clarity that whatever came next would change both of their lives forever. They pulled Mia the rest of the way free together, laying her gently on the grass beside the gaping hole, her breathing shallow but steady, her eyes struggling to focus on the two faces hovering above her. Ava cradled her sister's head in her lap, whispering her name over and over, as if saying it enough times could undo 3 years of unimaginable suffering. "I'm here," Ava kept saying, rocking slightly, tears falling onto her sister's dirt-streaked face. I'm here, you're safe now, I promise you're safe." Mia's cracked lips parted, and the first word she managed to whisper after 3 years of silence was her sister's name. Ethan sat back on his heels in the mud, watching the two women who shared a face cling to each other in the moonlight, and felt something inside him shift permanently. A recognition that the life he thought he understood had just been rewritten in front of him, and there was no going back to not knowing. This is where the truth begins to unravel. 3 years earlier, Ava's twin sister, Mia, had vanished from a family gathering, presumed dead in a car accident that never quite added up if anyone had bothered to look closely enough. No body was ever recovered. No real, conclusive evidence beyond a burned-out car found on a lonely stretch of highway outside the city. Its wreckage too convenient, too clean, for anyone paying real attention. But grief has a way of silencing doubt, and the family had grieved and moved on, because what else could they possibly do with a funeral, a casket, and a community offering condolences? But Ava had never fully believed it, not in the deepest, most private corner of her heart. She'd felt something in her chest, that invisible twin thread people talk about, the kind of bond science can't fully explain, telling her, insisting to her that Mia was still out there somewhere, alive, waiting. Tonight, everything had changed in the space of a single text message from an unknown number. Just a set of coordinates, followed by 4 words that had sent her running out of the house in her nightgown without stopping to think. She's still alive. Hurry! Against every rational instinct, against every voice in her head telling her this was a cruel hoax or a dangerous trap, Ava had driven straight to her own family's estate garden, because the coordinates led here. To the exact plot beneath the old oak tree, the same sacred spot where their late mother used to plant roses every single spring, tending them with a devotion that had become a family legend. Sitting in the grass now, cradling her sister's fragile body, Ava tried to explain all of this to Ethan in fragmented, breathless sentences, her mind still catching up to what her hands had just done. "I got the text an hour ago," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't call anyone. I didn't wake you. I just drove here like I was possessed, like my body already knew before my mind did. And when I got here and saw the ground had been disturbed, freshly turned, I just started digging. I didn't even think about what I was doing until you appeared." What Ava didn't yet know, what she was about to discover in the rawest, most devastating way possible, was why Mia had been buried there in the first place, and who exactly had orchestrated something so monstrous and sustained it for 3 entire years. Because someone in this story, someone close, someone trusted, had spent 3 years lying to everyone they claimed to love, sitting across from them at holiday dinners, offering comforting words at a funeral for a woman they knew was still breathing beneath the earth. And that person was closer than anyone in that garden could have imagined, closer than the walls of the very house standing behind them. Mia stirred weakly in Ava's arms, her cracked voice attempting words that kept dissolving into coughs and gasps. Ethan knelt beside them both, offering his own jacket to wrap around Mia's shivering shoulders, his mind racing through the implications of what he was witnessing. A woman thought dead for 3 years, buried alive in a chamber beneath a garden he had walked through 100 times without ever suspecting a thing. "We need to call an ambulance," he said finally, pulling his phone from his pajama pocket, his hands still trembling with adrenaline. "Right now. She needs a hospital." Ava nodded, unable to speak, still holding her sister as if letting go for even a second might undo the impossible miracle happening in front of her. And as Ethan dialed emergency services, his voice steady despite everything, Mia finally found enough strength to speak one full, coherent sentence. One sentence that would append everything the family thought they understood about the last 3 years of their lives. Mia's eyes opened fully now, gasping in the cool night air like she'd been holding her breath for 3 years, not 3 desperate minutes underground. "Ava!" she rasped, her voice a fragile whisper scraped raw from disuse. It was him. It was Daniel. Ethan's blood ran cold. Daniel, Ava's own stepbrother, the man who had inherited half the family company after Mia's accident, the man who had stood at Mia's empty casket funeral and wept louder and longer than anyone else in attendance, accepting condolences with trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes that everyone had assumed were genuine. Mia's story spilled out in broken, desperate fragments over the following minutes, pieced together between labored breaths and Ava's soft, steadying encouragement. Daniel had discovered 3 years ago that Mia was about to expose his years of quiet embezzlement from their late father's company. Falsified invoices, shell accounts, money siphoned slowly enough that no one had noticed until Mia, always the sharper of the two sisters when it came to numbers, had found the pattern hidden in the financial records. So Daniel had done the unthinkable. He staged her death using a car he'd purchased under a false name, drugged her into unconsciousness, and buried her in a sedated state inside a reinforced underground chamber beneath the garden, a space designed with disturbing precision to keep her alive but silent, fed just enough through a hidden mechanism to survive, kept sedated just enough to remain compliant, while he decided, over months and then years, what to ultimately do with her. Tonight, a guilt-ridden accomplice, someone who had helped construct the chamber years ago and had lived every single day since haunted by what they'd done, had finally cracked under the weight of their conscience and anonymously sent Ava the coordinates, unable to carry the secret any longer. Ava had risked everything on nothing but instinct, her reputation, her sanity, her upcoming wedding, quite possibly her own safety, crawling through mud at midnight because some unshakable sisterly instinct told her the truth mattered more than her own comfort or composure. "I didn't tell you sooner," Ava sobbed to Ethan, her whole body shaking now with the weight of relief and horror colliding at once, "because I didn't know if I was chasing a ghost or a miracle. I didn't want you to think I was losing my mind, showing up here in the middle of the night because of a text from a stranger." Ethan pulled both women into his arms, mud and dirt and all, holding them both as if he could physically shield them from the 3 years of horror that had just been laid bare in front of him. "You're not losing your mind," he whispered fiercely, his own voice thick with emotion. "You're the bravest person I've ever known. You dug through the earth with your bare hands because something in your heart told you to. That's not madness. That's love." In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder as they approached the estate, and Ethan felt a strange, surreal calm settle over him even as chaos closed in around them, the calm of knowing that whatever happened next, he would stand beside this woman through every bit of it. Mia's grip on her sister's hand tightened weakly, her eyes finding Ethan's for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing her." The next hours blurred into flashing lights, urgent voices, and the controlled chaos of paramedics working quickly and efficiently in the glow of headlights spilling across the ruined rose garden. Ava refused to leave her sister's side, gripping her hand tightly in the back of the ambulance as it sped toward the hospital, as if letting go for even a moment might somehow undo the impossible miracle that had just occurred. The paramedics worked around her, checking Mia's vitals, starting in 4-line, murmuring reassurances that her condition, while critical, was stable enough for the ride. Ethan followed in his own car, his hands still trembling on the steering wheel, his mind replaying the last 2 hours over and over, the hand breaking through the soil, Ava's torn fingers, the impossible sight of 2 identical faces staring at each other after 3 years of separation neither had chosen. At the hospital, the waiting room felt unbearably sterile after the raw chaos of the garden. Ava paced back and forth in her ruined pink gown, refusing offers of coffee or a change of clothes, her eyes fixed on the door where doctors had disappeared with her sister nearly an hour ago. Word moved fast, as it always does in families with money and history. By the time morning light crept through the hospital windows, detectives were already combing through Daniel's financial records at his penthouse apartment across the city, uncovering years of meticulously hidden fraud, forged signatures, and a paper trail that led with damning clarity straight to a private security firm hired years earlier to design and monitor the underground chamber. Daniel himself was arrested, attempting to board a private flight to Zurich just before dawn, his composed public mask finally slipping as federal agents read him his rights on the tarmac, cameras from a nearby news crew capturing every second of his unraveling. Back at the hospital, a doctor finally emerged to speak with Ava and Ethan, his expression cautiously optimistic. Mia was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and would need extensive treatment and psychological support in the weeks ahead, but she was remarkably stable. Life. Truly. finally alive in a way she hadn't been allowed to be for 3 long years. Ava collapsed into a chair the moment she heard the words, all the adrenaline that had carried her through the night finally draining out of her at once, leaving behind nothing but raw, exhausted relief. Ethan sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her trembling shoulders, saying nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. Sometimes love isn't found in grand speeches. Sometimes it's found simply in staying, in sitting quietly beside someone while they process the impossible. The family that had grieved Mia twice, once formally at a funeral 3 years ago and once quietly, every single day since in the private corners of their hearts, was suddenly given something they had long since stopped believing was possible. A second chance to say all the things that had been left unsaid, all the years that had been unfairly stolen from them. In the hospital room, sunlight finally broke gently through the blinds, casting soft golden stripes across the white sheets. Mia, cleaned up now and wrapped in warm blankets, looked at her twin sister with eyes that hadn't stopped shining with quiet disbelief since she'd woken up in a real bed, under real light, breathing real air that wasn't recycled through a hidden vent underground. "You dug through the ground for me," Mia whispered, her voice still hoarse but stronger now. "With your bare hands. In the middle of the night." Ava squeezed her sister's fingers gently, careful of the 4-line taped to the back of her hand. "I'd dig through anything for you," she said softly. "I always felt you out there, somehow, even when everyone told me to accept you were gone. I just didn't know how to explain that feeling to anyone without sounding completely insane." "You're not insane," Mia said, tears welling in her eyes again. "You're the reason I'm alive right now. If that text hadn't reached you, if you hadn't believed it, if you hadn't come." "Don't," Ava said gently, cutting her off. "Don't think about what could have happened. Just be here. Just breathe. That's all that matters right now." Ethan stood quietly by the window, watching the two sisters who looked identical but had lived 3 years worlds apart from one another, one grieving in silence at galas and family dinners, forcing smiles through unbearable loss, and the other surviving in complete darkness, sedated and starved, believing perhaps that the world had simply erased her from memory entirely. He thought about the wedding invitations already sent out, sitting in mailboxes across the country, and realized that whatever vows he eventually wrote now would carry a weight and meaning entirely different from what he'd originally planned. Because he hadn't just fallen in love with a beautiful, composed woman who ran board meetings with quiet authority. He'd fallen in love with someone whose loyalty ran so deep it had led her to claw through solid earth with her bare hands rather than let a single doubt stop her from following a stranger's desperate text message. A nurse came in quietly to check Mia's vitals, and for a moment the room fell into comfortable silence, filled only with the soft beeping of monitors and the sound of two sisters breathing in the same space again after 3 impossible years apart. "What happens now?" Mia asked eventually, her voice small, almost childlike in its vulnerability. "What do I even do with my life now? Everyone thinks I've been dead for 3 years. My apartment's gone. My job's gone. Everyone's moved on." Ava leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against her sister's. "Now," she said firmly, "you come home, you heal, and we figure out the rest together, one single day at a time, exactly like we always used to when we were kids and everything felt impossible." Ethan watched them, feeling a lump rise in his throat, and quietly resolved that whatever resources, whatever connections, whatever strength he had to offer, he would place all of it behind this family's healing without hesitation. The following weeks tested every ounce of strength this family had left, stretching them thin in ways none of them had anticipated even after everything they'd already survived. Mia needed time to heal, physically, from months of malnutrition and the lingering effects of prolonged sedation, and emotionally, from 3 years of near-total isolation in captivity, believing quietly and privately that the world had simply erased her from memory, moved on entirely without a second thought. Ava barely left her sister's side during those first difficult weeks, sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs, later moving into the guest room beside Mia's recovery suite at the estate, whispering old childhood memories late into the night to remind Mia who she was outside of the darkness she'd survived, reminding her of summers at the lake house, of the terrible haircuts they'd given each other as 10-year-olds, of inside jokes that had somehow survived 3 years of separation completely intact. Ethan quietly rearranged his entire business schedule during this period, delaying international deals that would have once seemed impossibly urgent, canceling meetings without apology, simply to be present in whatever small ways he could, bringing coffee to the hospital at odd hours, holding an umbrella over both sisters during a sudden rainstorm outside the estate, sitting in comfortable silence beside them when silence was needed far more than words or advice. The press caught wind of the story eventually, as these things always seem to do, and headlines exploded across news outlets within days. Billionaire's fiancé uncovers sister buried alive in backyard conspiracy, the twin who refused to stop believing, and dozens of variations that turned a deeply private family tragedy into a very public spectacle almost overnight. The world watched, stunned and captivated, as a story that read like fiction unfolded in real time. A reminder that truth, no matter how deeply and carefully it's buried, has a persistent way of clawing its way back to the surface eventually, no matter how long it takes or how many people conspire to keep it hidden. But behind the sensational headlines, behind the news vans parked outside the estate gates for weeks, was something far simpler and far more important. 2 sisters, holding hands in a quiet hospital room, slowly, patiently learning how to breathe again, how to trust the world again, how to simply exist together after everything that had tried to tear them apart permanently. Therapists were brought in gently, carefully, to help Mia process the trauma of her captivity without forcing her timeline. Ava attended many of these sessions alongside her, refusing to let her sister face any part of this recovery alone, even when the sessions grew difficult and painful and left both of them emotionally drained by the end. Ethan, for his part, learned an entirely new kind of patience during those weeks. The patience required to love someone through a crisis that had nothing to do with him directly, but everything to do with the woman he was choosing to build a life alongside. Daniel's trial moved forward relatively quickly once it began, the evidence against him simply overwhelming for any competent defense to counter effectively. Forged documents, a trail of hired accomplices willing to testify in exchange for reduced sentences, millions in embezzled funds traced meticulously back to offshore accounts, all of it collapsing under the sheer weight of one guilt-ridden anonymous text message that had started the entire unraveling. In court, Mia testified with a steadiness that surprised nearly everyone in the room, including herself. Her voice remained calm and clear as she described the chamber, the sedation, the years of near-total isolation, occasionally allowing herself brief pauses to collect her composure before continuing without ever breaking down completely. Ava sat directly behind her the entire time, in the front row of the gallery, never once looking away from her sister. Her presence a silent, unwavering anchor throughout every difficult hour of testimony. When the verdict finally came back, guilty on all counts including attempted murder, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment, there was no cheering in the courtroom, no triumphant outburst of relief. Just quiet tears shared between the sisters, and the exhausted hard-won peace of finally closing a wound that had been left painfully open for 3 long years. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions from behind a barrier of police tape, cameras flashing rapidly in the afternoon light. Ava simply held her sister's hand on one side and Ethan's arm on the other, and walked forward steadily without offering a single word to the crowd. Some victories they had all learned by now don't need speeches or statements. They simply need to be survived, quietly and completely, one difficult step at a time. That evening, back at the estate, the 3 of them sat together on the back porch overlooking the garden. The same garden that had once held such unimaginable horror, now simply quiet and still in the fading evening light. No one spoke for a long while. There was nothing left that needed to be said out loud. Eventually Mia broke the silence. "I keep thinking about how close I came to just disappearing forever," she said softly. "How easy it would have been for the world to just accept that I was gone." "But you didn't disappear," Ava said firmly, reaching for her sister's hand. "And you never will again." Not while I'm still breathing. Months passed slowly and gently, in the way that real healing always seems to happen. Mia gradually rebuilt her life, moving back into the family estate permanently, surrounded by people who loved her, and eventually finding the strength to walk back into the garden that had once held her captive. Instead of avoiding that patch of earth beneath the old oak tree, she chose, deliberately and courageously, to transform it. Working alongside Ava on quiet weekend afternoons, she planted new rose bushes over the very ground where she'd once been buried alive, turning a place of horror into something achingly beautiful. It felt wrong to let that spot just stay ugly and empty forever, she told Ava one warm afternoon, kneeling in soil that no longer held any secrets, her hands dirty in an entirely different, healing way now. I wanted it to become something alive again. Something that grows instead of something that just took. Ava knelt beside her in the same soil, the same way she had that desperate midnight months earlier. Except this time, there was no frantic digging, no fear, no gaping hole waiting to swallow either of them whole. Just two sisters, side by side, planting flowers together in warm afternoon sunlight, their laughter occasionally drifting across the quiet garden. Ethan watched from the porch most afternoons, a mug of coffee warming his hands, smiling in a way he genuinely hadn't smiled in years, feeling a quiet gratitude settle deep in his chest for the family he was about to officially join. Mia slowly returned to parts of her old life too, reconnecting carefully with old friends who had grieved her, rebuilding her professional reputation with the company's full support, and eventually finding a quiet, steady kind of joy in simply existing freely again, without fear, without chains, without a hidden chamber waiting beneath her feet. Sometimes, she confided to Ava during a late-night conversation, she still woke up gasping, momentarily convinced she was back underground. But those nights grew fewer and further apart as the months passed, replaced gradually by ordinary dreams, ordinary worries, the ordinary blessed monotony of a life finally allowed to continue. Sometimes the darkest nights of our lives, it turns out, lead us to the truest kind of love. Not just the romantic kind, but the fierce, unshakable love between people who simply refuse to give up on each other, no matter what the world tells them to believe, no matter how many years pass, no matter how impossible hope begins to feel. On their wedding day, 6 months later than originally planned, Ava walked down an aisle lined generously with the very roses that now bloomed brilliantly over what was once a hidden grave. A detail only the closest family understood the full weight of, though everyone could sense something meaningful in the choice. Mia stood as her maid of honor, radiant and healthy, color fully returned to her cheeks, standing tall and strong in a way that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Living, breathing proof that love, when it refuses to quit searching, can rewrite even the darkest possible endings. As Ethan took Ava's hands at the altar, surrounded by close family and friends beneath a canopy of white flowers, he leaned in slightly and whispered just loud enough for her alone to hear. "You taught me that real love doesn't run from the truth, no matter how deep it's been buried. Digs. With bare hands, if it absolutely has to." Ava smiled through happy tears, glancing briefly at her sister seated in the front row, radiant and whole. "I'd do it again," she whispered back. 1,000 times over, for the people I love most. The ceremony continued in warm afternoon light, vows exchanged with a depth of meaning neither of them could have fully anticipated 6 months earlier, before everything had changed in a single unforgettable night in that same garden. Later, during the reception, Mia stood to give a brief, heartfelt toast, her voice steady and clear in front of the gathered crowd. 3 years ago, she said, I lost everything. And one impossible night, my sister gave it all back to me, with nothing but her bare hands and a stubborn refusal to stop believing. That's the kind of love I got to witness firsthand. That's the kind of love standing at the front of this room today. The room erupted into warm applause, glasses raised high in celebration, and Ava reached instinctively for her sister's hand beneath the table, holding on just as tightly as she had that impossible midnight months before. And that, friends, is where our story ends tonight. Not with tragedy, but with roses blooming brightly over broken ground, and two sisters who refused to let a lie bury the truth of their unbreakable bond. The lesson here is simple, but it's one worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Never stop trusting the quiet voice inside you that says something isn't right, even when the whole world tells you to let it go and move on. Sometimes that instinct is the only thing standing between life and loss. If this story moved you even a little tonight, do me a favor. Hit that like button, it truly helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you'd like more stories exactly like this one, waiting for you every single week. And if you know someone who needs a gentle reminder that love and truth always find their way to the surface eventually, share this story with them tonight. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story. Pose.